Marcus Blackwood had ruled the vampire covens of New England for over 3 centuries, but nothing in his immortal existence had prepared him for the sound that now echoed through the marble halls of his estate. The piercing cries of an infant cut through the silence like silver daggers, making even his ancient servants wince and retreat to the far corners of the mansion. The child had been brought to him 3 nights ago by Elena Rossetti, his most trusted lieutenant. She had found the baby abandoned in an alley behind a Boston hospital, wrapped in nothing but a blood-stained hospital blanket. The scent that clung to the child told Marcus everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary human infant. The baby carried the unmistakable essence of vampire blood, mixed with something else that Marcus couldn't quite identify. "He won't feed," Elena reported, her usually composed demeanor cracking as the baby's wails grew louder. "We've tried everything. Warm blood, cold blood, even human milk from the servants. Nothing works. He just screams and screams." Marcus stood at the window of his study, his reflection absent from the ancient glass as he watched the sun set over his vast estate. The crying had been constant for 72 hours now, and even his supernatural patience was wearing thin. More concerning was the effect it was having on his household. His vampire servants were becoming agitated, their predatory instincts triggered by the distress. Several had already asked permission to leave the estate until the situation was resolved. "Perhaps we should take him to a hospital," suggested Dr. Peppermint. Richard Hawthorne, the human physician who had served the Blackwood family for decades, knowing full well what they were. The child might be seriously ill.
Marcus turned from the window, his pale blue eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom and pain.
"No hospitals. Too many questions would be asked about a child with no records, no birth certificate, no family." He paused as another particularly anguished cry echoed through the halls. "Besides, I can sense that he's not physically ill. There's something else troubling him." The baby had been placed in what was once Marcus's own nursery, a room that had remained untouched for over 200 years. The sight of the ornate crib and dust-covered toys had stirred memories that Marcus had long buried, memories of his own son, Thomas, who had died of plague in 1743. The loss had been one of the final pushes that drove Marcus to accept the dark gift of immortality, hoping to gain the power to protect those he loved. Instead, he had learned that some forms of loss couldn't be prevented, even by creatures who commanded the night. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself drawn to the nursery despite his better judgment. The infant lay in the crib, his tiny fists clenched as he screamed with a fury that seemed impossible for something so small. His hair was dark like Marcus's own, but his eyes held flecks of gold that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. "What are you?" Marcus whispered, reaching out with his supernatural senses to probe the child's essence. The baby was definitely part vampire. That much was clear from his enhanced lung capacity and the way his cries seemed to resonate with supernatural power. But there was something else, something that felt almost familiar. Elena appeared in the doorway, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from 3 days of attempted childcare. "The staff is requesting permission to use earplugs during the day," she said wearily. "Some of them haven't been able to rest at all." Marcus nodded absently, still studying the child. "There's something about him, Elena. Something I'm missing." He paused as a thought occurred to him. "You said you found him behind a hospital. Which hospital exactly?" "Boston General. The same hospital where—" Elena's voice trailed off as understanding dawned in her eyes. "Where Sarah worked," Marcus finished quietly. Sarah Mitchell had been the love of Marcus's immortal life, a human nurse who had somehow captured the heart he thought had died centuries ago. Their relationship had been impossible from the start. She was mortal, he was immortal. She saved lives, he took them to survive. But for 3 beautiful years, they had made it work. Sarah had known what he was and loved him anyway, seeing the man he had once been beneath the monster he had become. Their relationship had ended tragically when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Marcus had been overjoyed, believing that perhaps his enhanced supernatural genetics could create new life rather than just sustain his undead existence. But Sarah had been terrified. She knew the stories of vampire children, the hunger that could never be satisfied, the isolation from the human world, the curse of immortality thrust upon the innocent. One night, Sarah had simply vanished. Marcus had searched for months, using every supernatural resource at his disposal, but she had covered her tracks too well. He had assumed she had left the city, perhaps even the country, to escape him and the life growing inside her. The pain of her abandonment had driven him into a century-long period of darkness, during which he had become more monster than man. Now, Looking at the crying infant, Marcus began to piece together a different story. The timing was right. It had been exactly 9 months since Sarah had disappeared. The hospital where Elena had found the child was where Sarah had worked, and those golden flecks in the baby's eyes were exactly the same shade as Sarah's. "This is my son," Marcus said, the words feeling strange on his lips. And Sarah's expression softened with understanding and sympathy. Then why was he abandoned? If Sarah carried him to term, why would she leave him in an alley? Marcus's jaw tightened as darker possibilities occurred to him. Perhaps she didn't have a choice. He turned to Elena with renewed urgency. "I want you to investigate Sarah's disappearance. Check the hospital records, talk to her former colleagues, search for any trace of what happened to her. But be discreet. We can't afford to attract attention." As if responding to his father's recognition, the baby's cries suddenly intensified, becoming almost unbearable even to supernatural ears. Marcus approached the crib cautiously, his predatory instincts at war with an unfamiliar paternal protectiveness. "Hello, little one," he said softly, his voice carrying the hypnotic undertones that could calm even the most frightened human. But the baby seemed immune to his supernatural influence, continuing to wail with desperate intensity. Dr. Hawthorne entered the nursery carrying his medical bag. "I've been thinking about what you said, about him not being physically ill. Sometimes infants cry because they're seeking something specific. Comfort, security, a particular type of care that only certain people can provide."
What are you suggesting?
In my experience, some children bond so strongly with their mothers during pregnancy that separation causes genuine distress. The child might be crying because he senses that something fundamental is missing from his world.
Marcus stared down at his son, a plan beginning to form in his mind. If the child was crying because he missed his mother, then perhaps the solution wasn't to find ways to quiet him, but to find Sarah herself. Dead or alive, she was the key to understanding what was wrong with their child. But first, he needed to keep the baby healthy and safe until his investigation could bear fruit. Constant crying was beginning to take its toll. The child's voice was becoming hoarse, and Marcus could sense his energy flagging. Whatever was wrong needed to be addressed soon, or they might lose the baby entirely. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He would take the child out into the human world, hoping that a change of environment might provide some relief. It was risky. A vampire traveling during daylight hours was dangerous enough, but carrying a supernatural infant added layers of complexity to the venture. He had Elena prepare a specially tinted car with blackout windows and arrange for Dr. Hawthorne to accompany them. Their destination was a small diner near the hospital where Elena had found the child. It was a long shot, but Marcus hoped that someone there might remember Sarah or have information about what had happened to her. As they prepared to leave, Marcus wrapped the baby in a soft blanket, noting how the child's cries seemed to quiet slightly at his touch. Perhaps there was some biological recognition happening, some primitive understanding that this tall, pale man was family. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to imagine what it might have been like if Sarah had stayed, if they had raised this child together. The fantasy was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The drive to the diner was surreal. Marcus hadn't been out in daylight for decades, and even with the car's protection, he could feel the sun's power pressing against the tinted glass. The baby continued to cry, but with less intensity now, as if the motion of the vehicle was providing some small comfort. Rosie's diner was exactly the kind of place Marcus usually avoided, bright, cheerful, filled with the sounds and scents of human life. But as they pulled into the parking lot, he noticed something interesting. The baby's cries were becoming quieter, and his tiny head was turning toward the building, as if he sensed something familiar. "Stay with the car," Marcus instructed Elena. "Keep the engine running and the climate control active. If anything seems wrong, drive away immediately." Hawthorne helped Marcus navigate the challenge of entering the diner with a crying baby while avoiding as much sunlight as possible. The other patrons looked up with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance as the infant's wails echoed through the small space. Marcus chose a booth in the darkest corner of the diner, his supernatural senses immediately cataloging every human present. None of them were immediate threats, but he remained alert for any sign of recognition or hostility. Vampires were the stuff of legends to most humans, but there were always a few who knew the truth and might cause problems. A waitress approached their table, and Marcus felt his world shift on its axis. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with kind brown eyes and brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. But it wasn't her appearance that struck him. It was her scent. She carried the faintest trace of Sarah's perfume, a delicate floral fragrance that Marcus would recognize anywhere. "Can I get you gentlemen some coffee?" she asked, her voice warm and professional, despite the baby's continued crying. Her name tag read Jenny Mitchell. Mitchell, Sarah's last name. Marcus studied her face more carefully, looking for resemblances. The shape of her eyes was similar to Sarah's, and she had the same graceful way of moving. Could this be Sarah's sister? Her daughter? Someone else in her family? Actually, Marcus said carefully, "I was wondering if you might know someone who used to work at Boston General Hospital." Her name was Sarah Mitchell. Jenny's expression immediately became guarded, and Marcus caught the scent of sudden anxiety mixed with her natural warmth. "Why are you asking about Sarah?" Before Marcus could respond, something extraordinary happened. As Jenny leaned closer to their table, drawn by maternal instinct toward the crying baby, the infant's wails began to subside. His tiny eyes focused on her face, and for the first time in 3 days, he became quiet. The silence in the diner was profound. Other patrons turned to stare, amazed by the sudden change in the baby's behavior. Dr. Hawthorne raised his eyebrows in surprise, while Marcus felt his ancient heart skip a beat. Jenny looked down at the baby with wonder and confusion. "That's unusual," she said softly. "I've never seen a baby react to me like that before." The infant was now staring at Jenny with intense focus, his golden eyes bright and alert. One tiny hand had escaped from his blanket and was reaching toward her, as if he recognized something essential in her presence. "What's your relationship to Sarah Mitchell?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenny glanced around the diner nervously, then sat down across from Marcus and Dr. Hawthorne. "She was my older sister," she said quietly. "But she died 3 months ago. Complications during childbirth, they said." "The baby?" She paused, looking at the infant in Marcus's arms with growing recognition. "They told us the baby died too." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Sarah was dead. She had died bringing their son into the world, and somehow the child had ended up abandoned in an alley, presumed dead by his own family. The layers of tragedy and mystery were overwhelming, but one thing was becoming clear. This baby had recognized something in Jenny, some echo of his mother, that had finally brought him peace. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "we need to talk." Jenny Mitchell stared at the baby in Marcus's arms, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The infant who had been screaming moments before now lay peacefully, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of his blanket, golden eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "You're telling me this is Sarah's baby?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the diner's air conditioning. "But that's impossible." "I saw him at the hospital. He was so small, so still. The doctor said he didn't make it." Marcus leaned forward slightly, being careful not to move too quickly and potentially upset the now calm infant. "What exactly did you see at the hospital, Jenny? Tell me everything you remember." Jenny's eyes filled with tears as she recalled that terrible night 3 months ago. Sarah had been missing for weeks before she showed up at the emergency room. She was in labor, but something was wrong. She kept talking about someone coming for her, someone dangerous. She was terrified. Marcus. More scared than I'd ever seen her. The way Jenny said his name made Marcus realize that Sarah had told her sister about him. The recognition in Jenny's eyes wasn't just about the baby. She knew exactly who he was and what he was. "She told you about me," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Jenny nodded slowly. "She said you were the father, but that it was complicated. That you came from a different world, one that wasn't safe for children. She never used the word vampire, but she didn't need to. I could see it in her eyes, the fear and the love, all mixed together." Dr. Hawthorne cleared his throat gently. "Jenny, you mentioned seeing the baby at the hospital. Can you describe what happened?" "Sarah was in labor for 18 hours. Jenny continued, her voice breaking slightly. "The doctors said there were complications, something about the baby's genetics, blood incompatibilities they couldn't explain. When he was finally born, he wasn't breathing. They worked on him for what felt like hours, but eventually they gave up." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. But Sarah kept insisting he wasn't dead, that she could still feel him somehow. The doctors thought it was just grief, denial. They sedated her heavily, and she never woke up. Internal bleeding, they said. By morning, both of them were gone. Marcus felt a cold rage building in his chest. His son hadn't been dead. He had been born into a kind of suspended animation that human doctors wouldn't recognize. Many supernatural creatures began life in a state that mimicked death, requiring specific conditions to fully awaken. The medical staff had given up too soon, and their ignorance had cost Sarah her life. "What happened to the bodies?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer.
"That's where it gets strange," Jenny said, glancing around the diner to make sure they weren't being overheard.
I was supposed to identify them both, but when I got to the morgue, they said there had been a mix-up.
Sarah's body was there, but the baby was gone. They claimed there had been a clerical error, that his body had been sent for immediate cremation by mistake. The pieces were starting to come together in Marcus's mind. Someone had known what the baby was and had taken him from the morgue, either to protect him or exploit him. But whoever it was had eventually abandoned the infant, leaving him in that alley where Elena had found him. "Jenny," Marcus said carefully, "I need to ask you something important. When you look at this baby, what do you feel?" Jenny studied the infant's face, her expression growing thoughtful. "It's the strangest thing. I feel like I know him, like I've been waiting for him my whole life. It's similar to how I felt about Sarah when she was born. I was only 8 then, but I remember thinking she was the most important person in the world." The baby made a soft cooing sound and reached his tiny hand toward Jenny. Without thinking, she extended her finger and he grasped it with surprising strength. The moment their skin touched, something remarkable happened. The golden flecks in his eyes seemed to brighten, and a sense of profound peace settled over him. "He knows you," Dr. Hawthorne observed with professional fascination. "There's definitely a biological recognition happening here. In my medical opinion, this child has been seeking a specific type of maternal connection." Marcus nodded slowly. "The question is, what do we do now?" Jenny looked up at him with determination burning in her brown eyes. "We take care of him. Sarah died trying to protect this baby, and I won't let that sacrifice be meaningless. But I need to know everything, Marcus. What he is, what he'll need, what kind of dangers he might face." Over the next hour, Marcus found himself explaining things he had never thought he would discuss with a human outside of his immediate circle. He told Jenny about vampire physiology, about the unique challenges of raising a half-vampire child, about the political complexities of the supernatural world that might threaten an infant who represented a new evolution in their species. Jenny listened with remarkable composure, asking intelligent questions and showing no signs of the fear or revulsion that Marcus had expected. It occurred to him that Sarah had prepared her sister well for this conversation, probably hoping that someday Jenny might need this knowledge. "So he'll need blood to survive, but not necessarily human blood," Jenny summarized. "And he'll age more slowly than normal children, but he'll still go through recognizable developmental stages." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed, "and he'll need to learn control as he grows older. His supernatural abilities will manifest gradually, but without proper guidance, he could become dangerous to himself and others." The baby had fallen asleep in Marcus's arms, finally peaceful after days of distress. His tiny face was relaxed, and his breathing was steady and strong. For the first time since Elena had brought him to the estate, Marcus allowed himself to hope that his son might have a future. "There's something else," Jenny said quietly. "Something I didn't tell you about that night at the hospital." Marcus raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. "Before Sarah died, she whispered something to me. At the time, I thought it was just delirium from the medication. But now," Jenny took a deep breath. She said, "Tell him the baby's name is David. Tell him David means beloved, and that's what he'll always be. David." Marcus tested the name silently, finding that it felt right somehow. David Blackwood. Or perhaps David Mitchell, if they decided to honor his mother's family name. Either way, it was better than the baby or the child. "David," Marcus repeated aloud, and the infant stirred slightly at the sound, as if he recognized his own name. Hawthorne glanced at his watch. "Marcus, we should consider getting back. The sun is getting stronger, and David needs a proper feeding and rest." But Jenny reached across the table and gently touched Marcus's hand. "Wait. Before you go, I need to ask you something. What are your intentions with David? Are you planning to raise him in your world, or—" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus had been so focused on solving the mystery of David's distress that he hadn't fully considered the long-term implications. Raising a half-vampire child would be complicated under the best circumstances, but doing it alone, without anyone who understood both sides of the boy's heritage, seemed nearly impossible. "I honestly don't know," Marcus admitted. "I never planned to be a father. When Sarah disappeared, I assumed I would never see my child. I'm not sure I'm equipped to give him what he needs. But I am," Jenny said firmly. I'm a pediatric nurse. I understand child development, nutrition, medical care. I know about his mother's family, her history, the human side of his heritage. And after seeing how he responded to me today, I think he needs both of us. The proposal was unexpected but logical. David clearly needed the maternal connection that Jenny could provide, but he would also need Marcus's guidance to navigate his supernatural abilities. More importantly, he would need protection from those elements of the vampire world that might see a half-vampire child as either an abomination or a tool to be exploited. It wouldn't be safe for you, Marcus warned. Association with me, with my world, comes with serious risks. There are vampires who would see you as a liability, humans who would consider you a traitor to your species. Jenny's expression grew determined. Sarah knew those risks when she fell in love with you, and she was willing to face them for David's sake. I can't do any less for my nephew. The word seemed to settle something in Marcus's mind. Family. David wouldn't just be the son of a vampire king. He would be part of the Mitchell family as well, connected to a lineage of humans who had shown remarkable courage and loyalty. If we do this, Marcus said slowly, it will have to be done carefully. We'll need to establish a cover story, create legal documentation for David, set up a safe environment where both sides of his nature can be nurtured. I've been thinking about that, Jenny said. I could quit my job here and work as David's private nurse. You could be his guardian, maybe a distant relative who gained custody after his parents died. It's not that unusual for wealthy families to employ live-in care for their children. Hawthorne nodded approvingly. It's a sound plan. I could serve as David's official pediatrician, monitoring his development and helping to manage the unique aspects of his physiology. Between the three of us, we could provide him with comprehensive care. Marcus looked down at David, who was still sleeping peacefully in his arms. The infant's face was serene now, free of the distress that had marked his first days of life. Perhaps this was what Sarah had wanted all along, not just for her son to be safe, but for him to be loved by people who understood both sides of his nature. There's one more thing, Marcus said. If we do this, if we become David's family, there can be no secrets between us. Jenny, you'll need to know everything about my world. The good, the bad, and the genuinely terrifying. And you'll need to be prepared for the fact that David will grow up to be something unique, something that neither of our species has seen before. Jenny nodded solemnly. I understand, and I'm ready. As they prepared to leave the diner, Marcus noticed that several of the other patrons were smiling at them. To the outside world, they probably looked like a normal family, a father, a nanny, and a doctor taking care of a baby. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that this facade might be closer to the truth than any of them had expected. The drive back to the estate was markedly different from the trip out. David slept contentedly in Jenny's arms, occasionally making soft baby sounds but never crying. Marcus found himself glancing in the rearview mirror, watching this woman who had agreed to help raise his son based on nothing more than familial loyalty and maternal instinct. When they arrived at the Blackwood estate, Elena was waiting in the foyer with barely concealed relief on her face. The crying stopped, she said, stating the obvious. What happened? We found what David was looking for, Marcus replied, introducing Jenny to his household staff. He was missing his family. Elena studied Jenny with the calculating gaze of a career predator, but Marcus could see approval growing in her expression. Jenny met the vampire's stare steadily, showing no fear despite the obvious supernatural aura that surrounded Elena. She knows what we are, Elena observed. Yes, Marcus confirmed. And she's committed to helping care for David regardless. Over the following days, they established routines that worked for everyone. Jenny moved into the estate, taking over the care of David's nursery and establishing feeding schedules that balanced his need for blood with more conventional nutrition. Dr. Hawthorne visited daily to monitor David's development and to help Jenny understand the medical aspects of caring for a supernatural infant. Most importantly, David thrived. With Jenny's maternal presence and Marcus's protective oversight, he began to develop normally. He slept through the night, fed without difficulty, and showed the alert curiosity typical of healthy babies. The transformation was remarkable, from a distressed infant who seemed to be failing to thrive to a content, growing child who brought joy to the entire household. But their peaceful new arrangement was about to be tested. On David's 1-month anniversary at the estate, Elena brought disturbing news from the outside world. Elena burst into Marcus's study without knocking, her usual composure shattered by urgency. We have a problem, she announced, her voice tight with concern. Word has spread through the covens about David. They know what he is, and they're coming. Marcus looked up from the reports he had been reading, immediately alert. In the months since Jenny had joined their household, life had settled into a peaceful routine. David was thriving under her care, growing stronger and more alert each day. Marcus had begun to hope that they might be able to raise the boy in relative safety, away from the political machinations of the vampire world. That hope was apparently naive. How many? Marcus asked, already moving toward the weapons cabinet concealed behind his bookshelf. 3 covens so far, but more are expected. Vincent Castellanos is leading them. He's claiming that a half-vampire child represents a threat to the purity of our bloodlines. Elena's expression darkened with disgust. He's calling for David to be eliminated before he can mature and potentially create more hybrids. Marcus's jaw tightened. Vincent Castellanos was a traditionalist vampire who had opposed Marcus's leadership for decades. He represented the old guard, vampires who believed their species was superior to humans and should remain separate at all costs. The existence of David, living proof that vampires and humans could create viable offspring, challenged everything Vincent stood for. "Where's Jenny?" Marcus demanded. "In the nursery with David. She doesn't know about this yet." Marcus strode through the mansion toward the nursery, his mind racing through possibilities. Running wasn't an option. Vampires could track their scent anywhere in the world. Fighting might be necessary, but it would put both Jenny and David at terrible risk. There had to be another way. He found Jenny sitting in a rocking chair, gently singing a lullaby to David. The baby was alert and content, his golden eyes bright as he listened to her voice. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly normal, that it broke Marcus's heart to have to shatter it with news of approaching danger. "Jenny," he said softly, not wanting to startle either her or David. "We need to talk." Something in his tone made her look up with immediate concern. "What's wrong?" Marcus explained the situation as gently as possible, watching Jenny's face cycle through confusion, fear, and finally determination. When he finished, she stood up and moved to David's crib, placing herself between the baby and any potential threat. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted. "But I won't let them hurt either of you, that I promise." Hawthorne arrived within the hour, having been summoned by Elena. His face was grim as he listened to Marcus's explanation of the threat they faced. "How long before they arrive?" "Elena estimates 2 days at most," Marcus replied. "Vincent has never been known for patience, and he has enough followers to feel confident about a direct confrontation." "Then we need to make a decision quickly, Dr. Hawthorne said. "Fight, flee, or find a third option." Jenny had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "There is a third option. What if we don't wait for them to come to us?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "You said Vincent's problem is with what David represents, the mixing of vampire and human bloodlines. But what if we could prove that David isn't a threat to vampire purity, but rather an evolution that could strengthen both species?" "Doctor?" Hawthorne nodded thoughtfully. "From a medical standpoint, hybrid vigor is a well-documented phenomenon. David appears to be healthier and more resilient than either purely human or purely vampire infants." "That's all well and good in theory," Marcus said, "but Vincent isn't interested in scientific arguments. He sees David as an abomination that needs to be destroyed." "Then maybe we need to change his perspective," Jenny said firmly. "What if we could show him that David isn't just a random hybrid, but something special, something that could benefit the vampire community?" Marcus was beginning to understand what Jenny was suggesting, and it both impressed and terrified him. "You want to present David to the covens, use him to challenge their prejudices directly." "It's risky," Elena admitted, "but it might be the only way to ensure his long-term safety. If we can get enough covens to accept him, Vincent won't be able to act against him without starting a civil war." The plan that emerged over the next several hours was audacious and dangerous. They would arrange a formal gathering of the major vampire covens, presenting David not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a new evolution to be celebrated. Marcus would use his position as vampire king to demand a formal hearing, invoking ancient laws that required all significant disputes to be resolved through council rather than violence. "The key? Doctoru," Hawthorne explained. "We'll be demonstrating David's unique abilities. From my observations, he appears to have enhanced versions of both human and vampire traits. His emotional intelligence is remarkable for an infant, and his physical development is accelerated without losing the adaptability that makes humans so successful as a species." Jenny had her own contribution to the strategy. "I think David's greatest strength is his ability to bridge 2 worlds. He responded to me because I represented the human side of his heritage, but he also clearly recognizes Marcus as his father. He doesn't see humans and vampires as enemies. To him, they're just different parts of his family. The gathering was arranged for the following evening at Ravenswood Manor, a neutral location that had historically been used for intercoven negotiations. Marcus sent formal invitations to all the major covens in the region, invoking his authority as Vampire King to compel attendance. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nearly 50 vampires confirmed their presence, including several ancient ones who rarely emerged from their private sanctuaries. As the appointed time approached, Marcus found himself experiencing an emotion he hadn't felt in centuries: genuine fear. Not for himself, but for the innocent child who would be at the center of a political maelstrom. David seemed to sense the tension in the household, becoming fussier than usual and requiring extra attention from Jenny to remain calm. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked Jenny, as she prepared David for the journey to Ravenswood Manor. "Once we walk into that room, there will be no turning back. Some of those vampires have never seen a human except as prey." Jenny finished adjusting David's blanket and looked up at Marcus with quiet confidence. "I'm sure. David is Sarah's son, and he has every right to exist in this world. If these vampires can't see that, then the problem is with them, not with him." The drive to Ravenswood Manor was tense but uneventful. Marcus had arranged for additional security. Trusted vampires from his own coven who would ensure safe passage to and from the meeting. Elena rode in the lead car, while Dr. Hawthorne accompanied Marcus, Jenny, and David in the main vehicle. Ravenswood Manor was an imposing Gothic structure that had been built in the 18th century as a private residence for vampire nobility. Its great hall could accommodate large gatherings, and its remote location ensured privacy for sensitive discussions. As they approached the building, Marcus could see lights blazing in every window and sense the supernatural energy of dozens of vampires gathered in one place. "Remember," Marcus told Jenny as they prepared to enter the manor, "stay close to me at all times. Don't make direct eye contact with any vampire, except those you know. And if anything goes wrong, Dr. Hawthorne will get you and David out of here immediately." Jenny nodded, though Marcus could see that her hands were trembling slightly as she held David. The baby seemed remarkably calm considering the circumstances, his golden eyes bright and curious as they approached the manor's imposing entrance. The great hall of Ravenswood Manor was filled with vampires representing centuries of supernatural evolution. Ancient ones sat in ornate chairs along the walls, their pale faces marked by the accumulated wisdom and cruelty of millennia. Younger vampires stood in groups, their modern clothing contrasting sharply with the medieval architecture of the room. All conversation stopped as Marcus entered with his small entourage. Vincent Castellano stood at the far end of the hall, his dark hair perfectly styled and his expensive suit immaculate. He was surrounded by his supporters, traditionalist vampires who viewed any deviation from pure bloodlines as weakness. When he saw David in Jenny's arms, his expression twisted with disgust. "So," Vincent announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "the Vampire King brings his human pet and her mongrel offspring before us. How fitting." Marcus felt his anger rise, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing control now would only play into Vincent's hands. "I have invoked the ancient right of counsel," he said formally. "This child is under my protection, and any threat against him is a threat against me." An ancient vampire named Eloise Beaumont, one of the few females in the room, spoke up from her position near the fireplace. "What is it you want us to decide, Marcus?" "The child exists, that much is obvious. But what are the implications for our kind?" "David represents evolution," Marcus replied, moving to the center of the hall where all could see him clearly. "He carries the strengths of both species, the supernatural abilities of vampires combined with the adaptability and emotional intelligence of humans. Rather than being a threat to our bloodlines, he could be the key to our future survival." Vincent laughed coldly. "Survival? We are immortal, Marcus. We don't need the contamination of human blood to ensure our continuation. Don't we?" "Doctor." Hawthorne spoke up, his human voice sounding strange in the supernatural gathering. "Forgive my intrusion, but from a medical perspective, your species is showing signs of genetic stagnation. Birth rates are declining, supernatural abilities are weakening with each generation, and psychological disorders are becoming more common among your young. Hybrid vigor could address all of these issues." Several vampires hissed at the human's audacity in addressing them, but Eloise held up a hand for silence. "The human speaks of things we have observed ourselves," she admitted. "Continue, Doctor." Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward, showing remarkable courage in the face of dozens of predatory gazers. In the month I've been studying David, I've documented abilities that surpass both parent species. His healing rate is faster than normal humans, but more controlled than vampires. His emotional development is accelerated without losing empathy. His physical strength is enhanced without triggering the bloodlust that often affects young vampires. Pretty words, Vincent sneered. But words are not proof. Show us these supposed abilities.
Jenny looked at Marcus uncertainly. They had discussed this moment but hadn't been sure it would actually arise.
David was still an infant. His abilities were barely emerging, and demonstrating them could be dangerous for him. Very well, Marcus said. He nodded to Elena, who produced a small silver knife from her coat. Silver is poisonous to vampires, often fatal to infants. But David's hybrid nature should provide him with natural resistance. Several vampires gasped as Elena made a tiny cut on David's finger with a silver blade. The baby cried out briefly, but instead of the severe reaction that would have occurred in a vampire infant, his finger simply bled normally for a few moments before beginning to heal. Impressive, Eloise admitted, but one trick does not make him special. It was Jenny who provided the next demonstration, though she acted on pure instinct rather than planning. David had become fussy during the proceedings, and without thinking, she began to sing the same lullaby she used to calm him at home. The effect on the assembled vampires was immediate and profound. The ancient ones sat up straighter, their eyes widening with something that might have been recognition. The younger vampires looked confused, but found themselves drawn toward the sound of Jenny's voice.
That song, Eloise whispered. I haven't heard it in 3 centuries. Marcus realized what was happening.
Jenny was singing an old Irish lullaby that had been popular among vampires during the 18th century. She couldn't have known its significance. She was simply singing something that comforted David. But the baby's response to the song, combined with his supernatural heritage, was creating a resonance that touched something deep in the vampire's ancestral memories. David had stopped crying and was now looking around the room with bright, alert eyes. As Jenny continued singing, he began to make soft sounds, not crying but almost as if he were trying to harmonize with her voice. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, carrying undertones that seemed to speak directly to the vampire's ancient souls.
He hears the old songs, Eloise said softly. Songs that were old when I was young. How is that possible?
Because he is both of our worlds, Marcus replied. He carries the memory of our people but also the hope of humanity. He is what we could become if we stop fearing change and embrace evolution. The room had grown completely silent except for Jenny's singing and David's soft vocalizations. Even Vincent seemed affected by the display, his expression shifting from disgust to uncertainty. This proves nothing, Vincent said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The child may have some interesting abilities, but he is still an abomination. Half-breeds have no place in our society. Then you're condemning us all to extinction, said a voice from the back of the hall. Marcus turned to see Thomas Ashford, an ancient vampire who rarely spoke at gatherings but whose opinions carried enormous weight. I have lived for over 1,000 years, and in that time I have watched our numbers dwindle. While humans multiply and thrive, perhaps it is time to admit that our supposed superiority is actually a weakness. Other vampires began to murmur among themselves, and Marcus could sense the tide of opinion beginning to shift. David's demonstration had shown them possibilities they hadn't considered, and the older vampires especially seemed to recognize something valuable in the child. Vincent, however, wasn't finished. Even if we accept that the child has useful abilities, what about the precedent? Are we to encourage vampires to breed with humans? To dilute our bloodlines in pursuit of some theoretical advantage? Not encourage, Marcus replied carefully. But perhaps not forbid either. David exists, and he is remarkable. Rather than destroying him out of fear, we should study him, learn from him, and see what his development teaches us about our own potential. The debate continued for hours, with vampires arguing passionately on both sides. But as the night wore on, it became clear that David himself was winning more converts than any argument could. Jenny continued to care for him throughout the proceedings, and his calm, alert presence seemed to have a calming effect on even the most agitated vampires. Finally, Eloise called for a formal vote. All those in favor of accepting the child David as a member of our community, under the protection of Marcus Blackwood, signify by raising your hand. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity as hands slowly rose around the room. Marcus counted carefully, his ancient heart pounding with a rhythm he had almost forgotten. When the final tally was complete, David had been accepted by a margin of 3 votes. Vincent's face was dark with fury. but he couldn't argue with the democratic decision of the council. "This is a mistake that will haunt us for generations," he declared before storming out of the hall, followed by his most devoted supporters. As the gathering began to disperse, Eloise approached Marcus with a gentle smile. "Bring the child to see me in a month," she said. "I am curious to see how he develops, and I may have some insights that could help with his education." David slept peacefully in Jenny's arms, exhausted by the evening's excitement, but apparently unharmed by his first political appearance. Doctor Hawthorne was making notes about the vampire's reactions, already planning his next research paper on supernatural psychology. "You did well tonight," Marcus told Jenny as they approached the estate. "Both of you. I'm not sure we could have achieved this without your presence."
Jenny smiled down at David's sleeping face. "He's going to have an interesting life, isn't he?"
Very interesting, Marcus agreed.
"But I think he'll handle it well. He has good people looking out for him." As they settled back into the estate, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 months. He had gone from a solitary vampire king to the father of a revolutionary child, surrounded by humans and vampires who had become his chosen family. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was exactly the life he needed. David stirred in his crib as Jenny tucked him in for the night, his golden eyes opening briefly to focus on Marcus's face. For just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw recognition there. Not just the biological bond between father and son, but genuine understanding of what they had accomplished together. "Sleep well, David," Marcus whispered. "Tomorrow we start building the world you'll grow up in." Outside the nursery window, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the horizon. For the first time in centuries, Marcus found himself looking forward to the future rather than dwelling on the past. David would grow up knowing both sides of his heritage, protected by vampires and humans who loved him, free to become whatever his unique nature would allow. The Vampire King's infant had stopped crying because he had found what he was looking for, not just a mother figure in Jenny, but an entire family willing to fight for his right to exist. And in saving David, they had all discovered something valuable about themselves, and the possibility of building bridges between worlds that had been separate for far too long. As Marcus finally retired to his chambers as the sun rose, he smiled at the thought that his son would wake up in a world where vampires and humans could work together, where love could triumph over fear, and where the future was full of unlimited possibilities. David had brought them all together, and together they would make sure he never had to cry alone again.